For this reading, I'd like you to have out your Fusion packet. Please have it open to pages 208 and 209. I'm going to be reading the text, but then we're also going to be filling in on this timeline here. So, in the previous reading, we saw that when we're talking about the cell theory timeline, Robert Hooke was the one who had used that first microscope, and he saw tiny box-like spaces in a piece of cork, and he decided to call them cells. So that's how he came up with the terminology of cells. The next item on the timeline was that someone named Anton von Leeuwenhoek made drawings of organisms that he observed. So that's kind of like where it's coming. And now we are getting into these last three parts on a timeline. And so I'm going to read about those here. So, Cell Hall of Fame. What is cell theory? A scientific knowledge often results from the combining of the work of several scientists. For example, the discoveries of Matthias Schleiden, Theodor Schwann, and Rudolf Virchow led to one very important theory called the cell theory. The cell theory lists three basic characteristics of all cells and organisms. Number one, all organisms are made of one or more cells. Number two, the cell is the basic unit of all organisms. And number three, all cells come from existing cells. The cell theory is fundamental to the study of organisms, medicine, heredity, evolution, and all other aspects of science. Okay, so then what it's done is it's taken these three ideas or these three tenets of the cell theory and broken them down over here to explain them in more detail. So the first one, all organisms are made up of one or more cells. Anton von Leeuwenhoek was the first person to describe actual living cells when he looked at a drop of pond water under a microscope. These studies made scientists wonder if all living things were made up of cells. In 1838, Matthias Schleiden concluded that plants are made up of cells. Then in 1839, Theodor Schwann determined that all animal tissues are made up of cells. He concluded that organisms are made up of one or more cells. So when we're looking at this timeline, we can see this is cells of an iris plant. So Schleiden concluded, it tells us here, that plants are made of cells. So in this box here, plants are made of cells would be what we would add. And then in the box below, Theodor Schwann determined that animal tissues are made of cells and that all organisms are made of one or more cells. So in this box, animals are made of cells and all organisms are made of one or more cells. If you need to pause the video to write that, you may. And again, this information came right from this paragraph. All right, and then organisms that are made up of just one cell are called unicellular organisms. The single cell of a unicellular organism must carry out all the functions for life. Organisms that are made up of more than one cell are called multicellular organisms. The cells of multicellular organisms often have specialized functions. So then the second idea, the cell is the basic unit of all organisms. Based on his observations about the cellular makeup of organisms, Schwann made another conclusion. He determined that the cell is the basic unit of all living things. Thus, Schwann wrote the first two parts of the cell theory. So we can actually add that here. The cell is the basic unit of all living things. So the cell is the basic unit of all living things would also go here. And then finally, Virchow, and we can see this went from 38 to 39, so only a year difference here, but this is going from 39 all the way to 58. So in 1858, Rudolf Virchow, a doctor, proposed that cells could form only from the division of other cells. He then added the third part of the cell theory that all cells come from existing cells. So all cells come from existing cells.